My name is Ariana Lewis, I'm 31, and I work as an events coordinator here in Chicago. After years of grinding to build my career from the ground up, I finally managed to carve out a modest but stable life. So when I logged into my bank account the morning after my brother's wedding and saw that $8,400 had vanished, I froze. For a moment, I thought it had to be a mistake, a glitch, a delayed vendor payment. Anything but what I already knew in my gut was true. Then I called my mother. She didn't even try to deny it. "You're overreacting," she said with a light, mocking laugh. "You can't do anything about it anyway." Her voice was calm, cold, certain. I was shaking. But I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope I had tucked away the night before. My voice was steady when I told her, "Don't worry about what happens next." Before I tell you how this nightmare unfolded, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever had to stand up to your own family, I hope you'll hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story. Someone out there might need it. To understand how things got this bad, how a stolen $8,400 was just the breaking point in a much deeper betrayal, you'd have to go back to the beginning. Back to the Lewis family dynamic, where everything always looked perfect from the outside. I grew up in Evanston, in a big white colonial house with black shutters and manicured hedges. My father, Martin Lewis, ran a real estate empire in Chicago. My mother, Valerie, kept our home museum clean and socially spotless. And my younger brother, Noah, well, he was their golden boy from day one. As for me, I was raised to be useful, polished, presentable, invisible. From the moment Noah could walk, it was clear he would inherit everything: business, reputation, pride. And I was simply expected to support, smile, host, plan, keep the edges smooth. I don't think they ever imagined I'd have ambitions of my own. They certainly didn't respect them when I did. But for years, I tried to earn their approval. I got top grades, went to Northwestern, landed internships before my peers, and when I joined my father's company after graduation, I thought, naively, that maybe now they'd see me, respect me. Instead, what happened there nearly broke me. But I'll get to that soon. Because the truth is, what happened with the wedding wasn't sudden. It was a slow erosion, a lifetime of being taken for granted, one silent sacrifice at a time. And it all began long before a single flower was ordered, long before my savings account was emptied, long before I realized my own mother believed she had the right to take from me. What happened next didn't just shake my trust, it forced me to finally draw a line I should have drawn years ago. And that's where the real story begins. Looking back, I suppose the signs were always there. The missing money was just the final blow in a lifetime of quiet erasure. In our house, Noah didn't walk. He was carried, praised for everything, excused for anything. When he scribbled on the walls, it was creative. When I colored outside the lines, it was sloppy. He didn't have curfews. I had check-ins. His C's were blamed on boys being boys. My A- came with a lecture on not coasting. That imbalance wasn't just casual favoritism, it was doctrine. Valerie had a vision, and Noah fit it perfectly. He was the future CEO, the heir, the Lewis legacy wrapped in a tailored suit. Meanwhile, I was told, gently but firmly, that my value would be in who I married and how well I hosted. Dinner was a performance. Dad at the head of the table with his cufflinks gleaming, Mom critiquing everything from how I held my fork to how I spoke too directly. If Noah had a rough day, we tiptoed around his mood. If I had one, I was called dramatic or told I was too sensitive. And that label, it stuck. Even when I tried to express anything, hurt, disappointment, frustration, it was dismissed with a sigh or an eye roll. It taught me early on to swallow my emotions, tuck them away neatly like the linen napkins my mother insisted we use every night. I still remember the first time I got straight A's and showed them my report card, beaming. My father nodded once, unimpressed. "You were expected to." But when Noah passed a math class he nearly failed, they threw him a steak dinner. By the time I reached high school, I had stopped trying to impress them and started planning my escape. Northwestern became my goal not just for the degree, but because it meant dorm life, distance, and freedom, even if it was only 40 minutes away. But even after I moved out, the pattern followed me. Family birthdays, holidays, milestone dinners. I was always the one expected to plan, to host, to make sure everyone else felt comfortable, even when I was barely holding it together. And somehow, the more I gave, the less I seemed to matter. That dynamic followed me into adulthood. It echoed in every phone call with my mother, where she'd ask about Noah's promotion before she remembered to ask if I was still working that little events thing. It echoed in every visit home where I was greeted like a polite guest, not a daughter. It's painful to admit now, but for years I convinced myself that if I just tried a little harder, they'd finally see me. That one perfect dinner, one perfectly executed holiday, one show of selflessness too big to ignore, maybe then I'd matter. So when Noah got engaged, I told myself that this was my moment, that if I gave them the perfect wedding, the gratitude would come, that this time they'd say, "We couldn't have done it without you." Instead, they said nothing, and that silence was louder than any betrayal. That silence. It stayed with me long after the wedding invitations were mailed. But the truth is, the foundation of that silence had been poured years earlier, back when I tried to work for the family business. After graduating from Northwestern, I joined Lewis & Co., my father's real estate firm in downtown Chicago. On paper, it made sense. I had a business degree, a sharp mind, and the drive to prove myself. But from day one, it was clear. I wasn't there to lead. I was there to fill space, be presentable, keep quiet. My title was Marketing Coordinator, but really, I was a glorified assistant. Any idea I pitched in meetings was either dismissed or credited to someone else. The office culture was steeped in testosterone and hierarchy, and Martin Lewis made sure everyone knew who was worthy of being groomed to lead and who wasn't. Noah had barely finished college with a 2.8 GPA, yet he was instantly given access to client meetings and development proposals. I once suggested we revamp our branding to attract younger buyers and was told, "Maybe stick to planning office parties, Ariana." That one stung more than I admitted. Still, I tried. For 3 years, I smiled through it. I told myself this was a stepping stone, that eventually they'd see I had what it took, that they'd realize I wasn't just some decorative daughter there to arrange coffee and color palettes. But every step forward was met with resistance. Every contribution was a threat to the status quo. The final straw came during a quarterly meeting when I suggested bringing in a tech consultant to modernize our client interface. My father cut me off mid-sentence. "Real estate is about relationships, not apps," he barked. Then, in front of the whole team, "This isn't some hobby, Ariana. This is serious business." I remember walking out of that meeting, standing in the hallway outside the conference room, and realizing I was never going to be taken seriously in that building. Not by them, not ever. So I left. I handed in my resignation that Friday. No dramatic speech, no begging for understanding, just a quiet email and a long exhale. Valerie's response? A single sentence. "Well, I hope you have a backup plan." I did. I moved into a modest one-bedroom in Lincoln Park and launched my freelance event planning business from my kitchen table. My savings were thin, my confidence thinner. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't living under their expectations. The early years were brutal. Ramen for dinner, Craigslist furniture, weekends spent working back-to-back weddings just to break even. But those struggles built something no family inheritance ever could, a life I created with my own 2 hands. Eventually, the referrals came. Then, repeat clients. And slowly, my little one-woman operation became a respected name. Lakeview Events Studio. I thought I had finally found peace, outside the Lewis name, outside their shadows. But I should have known. The past always finds a way to reach back in, especially when it thinks you still owe it something. That's the thing about family. Just when you think you've finally stepped outside their orbit, they find new ways to pull you back in. For me, that pull came in the form of an engagement announcement over a roast chicken dinner. We were gathered in the dining room of my parents' Evanston home, the same one with the pristine white crown molding and table settings that hadn't changed in 20 years. My mother, Valerie, was in one of her high-gloss moods, bubbling with something she clearly wanted to announce but pretending it was all casual. And then Noah dropped it. "I proposed to Camille," he said, grinning like he'd just landed a 6-figure contract. She said yes. Valerie clapped her hands as if she'd just won the lottery. "Oh, sweetheart, finally. Camille Hastings will make such a stunning addition to the family." My father nodded approvingly. "The Hastings name brings excellent business connections, and their hotel portfolio could be strategic." I sat there, slowly chewing my too-dry chicken, invisible again. They talked for the next 40 minutes about venues, guest counts, signature cocktails, and Camille's gown preferences. Every now and then someone would glance at me, not for input, but for confirmation. As if my only job was to agree with whatever plan was already being made. Finally, Valerie turned to me with that familiar, saccharine tone. "Ariana, since you have all those industry contacts, you could help with some of the decor and vendor bookings, right? Maybe coordinate the florals, and perhaps the photography too?" It wasn't a question. It never was. Before I could finish swallowing my sip of water, the conversation had already moved on. They were discussing the engagement party location. My name never came up again, except in reference to what I could handle. That night, driving back to my apartment in Lincoln Park, I kept telling myself I had a choice. I didn't have to agree to any of it. I didn't have to be the unpaid coordinator of a wedding that clearly wasn't about love so much as optics. But deep down, I still hoped, stupidly maybe, that this time would be different. That if I made everything perfect, if I made them look good, maybe I'd finally earn more than a pat on the back or a passing thank you. So when the first email from Camille's planner came through asking for my creative input, I didn't hit delete. I rolled up my sleeves, opened a blank spreadsheet, and once again stepped into the role they always expected me to play. It started small, like it always does. A few emails asking for quick feedback, a phone call about linen samples, a group chat Valerie created titled Ariana's Wedding Magic that somehow ballooned into a planning thread with over 70 unread messages in 2 days. At first, I convinced myself it was manageable. I'd help with a few vendor calls, maybe secure a discount here and there. But I should have known better. Nothing with my family is ever just a favor. It always turns into an expectation. The first real warning came during a family brunch at my parents' house in Evanston. Camille was showing Valerie an inspiration board on her iPad, pastel florals, suspended orchid garlands, candlelight everywhere. She smiled sweetly at me across the table. "Since you know all the best vendors in the city, could you handle the florals? Maybe even the lighting, too?" Valerie didn't even wait for my answer. "Of course she can. Ariana's got all the right contacts. And taste." It wasn't a compliment. It was an assignment. From there, things escalated fast. I was looped into every planning meeting, half of which I didn't even know I was attending until the night before. They were held at my parents' house, always midweek, always at 6 p.m., perfectly timed to wreck my work schedule. Every time I tried to set a boundary, Valerie would pivot with emotional sleight of hand. "But this is Noah's only wedding," she'd say, or worse, "You always make things look so effortless. That's your gift, sweetheart." As if being overworked and underappreciated was something to be proud of. By the time Camille's bridal shower rolled around, I had already fronted payments for vendor deposits, design samples, and custom signage, none of which had been reimbursed. Every time I brought it up, I got the same vague promise, "We'll settle up soon." Soon never came. And yet, part of me still wanted to believe, wanted so badly for this to be the turning point. That maybe, if I gave them everything this time, they'd finally give me something in return. Respect, recognition, a place that felt like mine. So I pushed through. I kept spreadsheets, built mood boards, attended walkthroughs, answered emails at midnight, smiled at people who saw me as nothing more than the help. And all the while, I kept dipping deeper into the savings I had once protected like a lifeline. The account I was growing to buy a place of my own, it was shrinking. And I didn't even realize yet just how much more they were willing to take. The money wasn't vanishing all at once. It was slipping away in quiet, almost invisible increments. A deposit here, a rush fee there, an extra charge for upgraded napkin textures I hadn't even agreed to. I told myself I was keeping track, that I'd reconcile everything once things calmed down. But nothing ever calmed down. At one point, I opened my savings account late at night, bleary-eyed after back-to-back events, and realized I had spent more than $12,000. I stared at the number for a long time, like it might somehow shift if I blinked enough times. I wanted to scream, but there was always another meeting, another urgent decision, another favor disguised as flattery. At a planning session in Valerie's kitchen, Camille showed me a photo of a flower arch dripping in white peonies and imported roses. "This would be just magical for the entrance, don't you think?" she cooed. I did think it was magical. I also knew it would cost close to $4,000 and that the florist had already quoted us half that for the original plan. I cleared my throat. "That's a pretty steep upgrade." Valerie didn't miss a beat. "It's Noah's only wedding, Ariana. Don't nitpick." That phrase. That damn phrase. I wanted to ask, was my future worth anything? Or was I just the collateral damage for someone else's only wedding? But I said nothing, just smiled, nodded, took notes, and I kept paying. When I asked about the reimbursements again, Valerie waved it off. "Once the final numbers come in, we'll go through everything. Don't worry." But I did worry. I was up late at night sorting receipts, afraid to even order takeout for myself. I started taking on smaller last-minute gigs on weekends just to feel some semblance of control over the cash I was bleeding. Chloe, my best friend since college, noticed the change. "You're disappearing," she said one night over coffee. "You've lost weight, you're exhausted, and you haven't done anything for yourself in weeks. What are they giving you in return, Ariana? Recognition? Appreciation? No, just more requests." I lied and told her I was fine, that it would all be worth it, that this was temporary. But even as the words left my mouth, I didn't believe them. Because deep down, I knew. This wasn't about one wedding. This was about a pattern I had spent my whole life enabling, and I was starting to run out of pieces of myself to give away. By the time we hit mid-July, I was already stretched thinner than I'd ever been. My savings were nearly gone, and I was juggling 4 extra clients just to stay afloat. But it still wasn't enough. Because just when I thought the demands couldn't grow any more excessive, Camille discovered Pinterest. We were in the sunroom of my parents' house, another impromptu planning meeting that Valerie had scheduled without asking. I was seated with my laptop open, trying to finalize quotes with the florist, when Camille leaned over with her phone and that signature syrupy smile. "I saw this online," she said. "Wouldn't it be breathtaking to have cascading orchid garlands suspended over each reception table?" I stared at the photo, hundreds of white and blush orchids strung like chandeliers, floating midair. Gorgeous? Yes. Realistic? Not in the slightest. "I mean, we originally agreed on simple centerpieces," I replied gently. "This is at least triple the cost." Valerie didn't even blink. "It's an investment in ambiance. It's one night. We can't cut corners." I fought to keep my tone even. "We're already pushing the floral budget. I can price it out, but I can't guarantee we'll find someone who can execute that within the timeline or the cost." Camille pouted. "But it's the vision now, and you're so talented, Ariana. I know you'll make it happen." It wasn't a compliment. It was a trap. Because when Camille smiled like that, Valerie always followed. "Just get a few quotes, dear. We'll figure it out." But we never figured it out. I did. Quietly. Desperately. alone. I called every floral vendor I trusted, negotiated late-night revisions, and rearranged entire room schematics to accommodate the weight of the suspended pieces, all while pretending I was happy to help. And of course, I paid the deposits. The cost for the orchid garlands alone? Nearly $4,000. When I sent the updated quote to Valerie for review, she replied with a single word: approved. No mention of how it would be paid, no follow-up about reimbursement, just the quiet assumption that it was handled. And that's how it always was with my family. They didn't need to say the words out loud. Their expectations were baked into the silence. Noah, meanwhile, stayed mostly absent. If I brought up a concern, he'd nod distractedly, promise to check with Camille, and vanish again. I remember looking at my spreadsheet that night, watching the numbers shift with every invoice, and realizing with bone-deep certainty, this wedding wasn't costing me money. It was costing me everything: sleep, time, sanity, and maybe worst of all, hope. Hope that any of this would be seen, that any of it would matter, because deep down I already knew how this story ended, and it wouldn't end with gratitude. The closer we got to the wedding, the more my life stopped resembling anything that felt like mine. My apartment in Lincoln Park became a warehouse for sample linens, floral mock-ups, and forgotten meals. I started sleeping on the couch, not because I wanted to, but because I was too exhausted to make it to bed. Everything I did, every email, every decision, every breath, revolved around Noah and Camille's perfect day. And still, it was never enough. At one point, I offered 3 different options for cocktail hour linens, all within budget, all elegant. Camille glanced at them for 2 seconds and wrinkled her nose. "None of these feel elevated," she said. "Can we do custom embroidery?" Valerie chimed in. "Absolutely. Ariana knows people." It wasn't a request. It was another assignment. Every time I raised a concern about cost, timing, logistics, I was either ignored or labeled difficult. Valerie called me too emotionally attached. Camille laughed and said, "You really take things personally, don't you?" As if caring was a weakness. But I wasn't just caring. I was drowning. The balance in my savings account dropped below $5,000. That number had always been my line, the emergency cushion I promised myself I'd never touch. But now, with each new upgrade, each new non-negotiable, I kept inching closer to the edge. I picked up extra gigs, bar mitzvahs, last-minute pop-up brunches, corporate product launches. I worked through migraines, missed friend birthdays, ate protein bars for dinner at midnight standing over my kitchen sink. And no one noticed. Noah, especially, seemed oblivious. I'd catch glimpses of him scrolling on his phone during planning calls or ducking out early with some excuse about last-minute errands. He never asked how I was holding up, never even offered to split costs. If Camille was the queen, Noah was the absentee king, smiling for photos, avoiding the work. And I was the invisible labor propping up their fantasy. There was one night, late August, when I got home after a 10-hour event and immediately started prepping mood boards for Camille's welcome baskets. My eyes burned, my hands ached, and still I couldn't stop, because what was I going to do? Say no? The truth is, I didn't know how. I had spent my entire life trying to earn love by being useful, by saying yes, staying quiet, and making everything seamless. But this time the seams were starting to tear, and beneath them I could feel something dangerous rising, not just exhaustion, but anger. Real, righteous, long-silenced anger. By the time the night before the wedding arrived, I wasn't a person anymore. I was a production crew in a cocktail dress. At 11:47 p.m., I was still at the Drake Hotel, walking the perimeter of the ballroom, clipboard in hand, double-checking floor plans and floral installations. The orchid garlands, those Pinterest-inspired monstrosities, were finally being hung. And yes, they were breathtaking. They also cost me nearly $4,000, none of which had been reimbursed. I stood back to watch the crew work, physically numb. My back ached, My shoes pinched, my entire body was vibrating with overuse and undersleep. And then, my phone buzzed. A text from Valerie. "Don't forget to pick up Camille's mother's breakfast by 7 a.m., gluten-free. No dairy, no eggs, no excuses, no thank you, no are you okay? Just another task." I stared at the screen and felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just hollow. I had gone so far past exhaustion that even my emotions had shut down. I looked around the ballroom, glowing up in candlelight and orchids, and it felt like I was setting the stage for someone else's fairy tale while being slowly erased from the credits. I told myself to finish strong. Just one more day. One more performance. But as I gathered my things to head home, something in me wavered. I passed by a mirror near the service entrance and barely recognized the woman staring back. Pale, eyes sunken, shoulders slumped forward like she was always bracing for impact. I had built this wedding with my own hands, and yet I felt like a stranger in its reflection. That night, back at my apartment, I sat on the floor in my dress clothes, surrounded by receipts and vendor checklists. I opened my banking app out of habit and froze. $21,786. That's how much I had spent so far. $21,786. Gone. That was supposed to be my down payment. My future. My first real step towards something of my own. With shaking hands, I transferred another payment. This one for the last-minute ice sculpture Camille's father insisted on. A swan holding 2 champagne flutes. Essential, apparently. As the confirmation message popped up, a wave of nausea rose in my throat. I barely made it to the bathroom in time. I clung to the edge of the sink, willing my breathing to slow down, staring at the tiles like they might ground me. What was I doing? Why was I the one bleeding myself dry for people who wouldn't even acknowledge it? And yet, I wiped my face. I stood up. Because I knew, tomorrow I'd still be the first one at the venue, and they'd still expect me to smile. The morning of the wedding arrived crisp and clear, with that kind of early October chill in Chicago that makes you breathe a little deeper. But I wasn't breathing. I was racing. By 6 a.m., I was already at Camille's parents' hotel suite with a paper bag of gluten-free, dairy-free, egg-free breakfast from some overpriced cafe across town. Valerie's text still burned in the back of my mind. No excuses. After that, I was bouncing between vendors like a ping-pong ball, confirming chair delivery, checking on the ice sculpture, directing the florist team. I was wearing sneakers under my tailored black slacks, knowing I'd swap into heels 5 minutes before guests arrived. My dress and makeup? Still untouched in a garment bag hanging in the staff closet. By 10:30, I stepped into the ballroom at the Drake Hotel and stopped in my tracks. The orchid installations were complete, soft pink and white blooms spilling from above, catching the morning light like something out of a fantasy film. They were stunning. They were also mine. Not figuratively, literally. I had paid for every single strand, every wired stem, every beam used to suspend them. But as I admired the room, Valerie came sweeping in, silk robe fluttering behind her. "The place cards are wrong," she said immediately. "It's Henderson, not Hendrickson. Fix it." No good morning, no acknowledgement of everything I'd coordinated, just a problem dumped at my feet. I didn't argue. I just nodded, took a breath, and moved. It was easier that way. The ceremony itself, hours later, was undeniably beautiful. The old cathedral glowed with hundreds of candles lining the aisle. Camille looked radiant in her custom gown. Noah even teared up when he saw her walk in, which shocked me, honestly. And for a second, just a second, I let myself feel something that wasn't resentment. Pride, maybe. That I had helped build this moment, that I had created something extraordinary, but the feeling didn't last. At the reception, I was seated at a far-flung table with distant cousins and 2 of Camille's sorority sisters I'd never met. As I picked at my $125 plate of dry salmon, Camille's father passed by and clapped me on the shoulder. "Your parents really went all out, huh?" he chuckled. "They spared no expense." I smiled, but inside something cracked. They really believed that Martin and Valerie Lewis had bankrolled this event, that I was just another guest, not the one who funded, coordinated, and sacrificed for nearly every inch of it. And when Noah finally approached me, hours into the evening, champagne in hand, his words sealed it. "Hey," he said, glancing around distractedly. "Thanks for helping with the wedding stuff. Camille's really happy." Then he was gone, off to take photos, toast, dance, and I was left holding a bouquet I hadn't chosen, in a dress I barely had time to zip, wondering when exactly I'd stopped being a sister and started being staff. Around 9 p.m., the ballroom was alive with music and laughter, Camille twirling in her second dress, guests swirling champagne, the band easing into some jazzy version of At Last. And yet, I'd never felt more alone in a room full of people. The spotlight was exactly where it was always meant to be, on Noah, on Camille, on the fantasy, but not on the architect behind it. I slipped away, not dramatically, no storming out, just quietly excused myself and walked toward the nearest hallway bathroom, one reserved for staff and vendors. It felt more honest that way. Once inside, I locked the stall and sat down. Not to cry, not at first, just to breathe. My feet throbbed. My back ached. My jaw, tense for weeks, finally began to unclench. And then, as I looked down at the hem of my dress pooled around my ankles, the tears came. Not the pretty, cinematic kind, the ugly kind, the kind that shake your ribs and make your mascara sting. I pressed a paper towel to my mouth to muffle the sound. I didn't want anyone to hear me. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing how much it hurt, because I had done everything, and they still made me feel like I was nothing. I had spent nearly $22,000, my future home, my security, so they could take credit for a night they barely lifted a finger to create. I had worked 15-hour days, skipped meals, canceled plans, all so Valerie could preen and Camille could shine and Noah could coast. And in return, I got a "thanks for helping with stuff." I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I heard the bathroom door creak open. "Ariana?" It was Chloe. I didn't answer at first, just pulled myself up, wiped my face with a fresh towel, and stepped out. Her eyes went soft the second she saw me. "There you are," she said gently. "I've been looking everywhere." "I just needed a minute," I croaked, voice hoarse. She reached for my hand. "You okay?" I wanted to lie. I wanted to say I was fine, that it didn't matter, that I was used to it, but I couldn't, not anymore. "No," I whispered. "I'm not okay. I've let them use me, again." Chloe didn't flinch. She didn't tell me to be stronger or keep the peace. She just nodded. "You don't have to keep doing this, you know," she said. "You don't have to keep playing the role they gave you." I stared at myself in the mirror, mascara smudged, eyes swollen, but something different behind the pain, a flicker of clarity. "What am I supposed to do?" I asked. "Make a scene at my brother's wedding?" "No," Chloe said, "but you can stop pretending it doesn't hurt. You can stop pretending this is love." That hit harder than anything, and as I reapplied my lipstick and adjusted my dress, I made a silent promise. This would be the last time. The last time I sacrificed myself for their approval. The last time I stayed silent to keep things pretty. I just didn't know yet how quickly I'd be forced to act on that promise, or how deep the betrayal would really go. As Chloe and I stepped out of the bathroom, the hallway was empty, lit by soft sconces and muffled by the distant hum of the band. For a moment, I considered heading straight for the ballroom exit. I wanted nothing more than to vanish, to curl up in bed and pretend this night hadn't stripped me raw. But something stopped me. Just down the corridor, one of the small meeting rooms that the Drake Hotel had reserved for family storage had its door slightly ajar. It was the room where I'd placed my purse earlier, too bulky to carry during setup, too risky to leave behind otherwise. I was planning to grab it on my way out. As I approached, I heard voices inside. Low, intentional, familiar. "I'm telling you, she'll never even notice," my mother's voice murmured. My breath caught. "Mom, I don't know." Noah's voice followed, hesitant. "Ariana's already paid for so much. This feels wrong." Valerie exhaled sharply. "Don't be ridiculous. It's just sitting in her account doing nothing. This way, it benefits the whole family. Now go. Camille's probably wondering where you are." I froze, back pressed against the hallway wall, heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the rest. My mouth went dry. They had gone into my account? I backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound. My hands were trembling as I re-entered the ballroom, its sparkle now blinding, its laughter suddenly hollow. I tried to act normal, smiled when people passed, nodded when one of Camille's bridesmaids complimented the floral displays. But inside, something had shattered. My chest felt tight, my thoughts racing. What had they done? What had they taken? I didn't wait for the reception to end. The moment the last major toast was given and the dance floor filled again, I slipped out. No goodbyes, no lingering glances, just me, my heels in one hand, and a thundering sense of dread chasing my every step. Back in my apartment, I didn't bother turning on the lights. I collapsed onto the couch, still in my dress, too wired to sleep, too panicked to breathe. I stared at the ceiling and replayed the words over and over. "She'll never even notice." Except now, I did. And whatever line I'd been unwilling to cross before, they had crossed it for me. And something deep inside me, something they'd spent years teaching me to suppress, was beginning to wake up. Not just anger. Resolve. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that cracked office door, heard my mother's voice saying, "She'll never even notice." It played like a broken record in my head, refusing to let me rest. By the time the sun crept through the blinds in my Lincoln Park apartment, I was already up, clutching a mug of coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. One breath, one click, one login to my bank account. There it was, $8,400. Transferred out at 9:17 p.m. the night before. Recipient, Valerie Lewis. I stared at the screen, willing the numbers to rearrange themselves, hoping, irrationally, that I had typed something wrong or misread the transaction. But no, it was real. The timing? Exactly when I had been locked in a bathroom stall, crying my eyes out. I checked the details again. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a debit card swipe. It was a mobile banking transfer. Through my app, using my login. Which made no sense. I hadn't even touched my phone during that time. It had been zipped into the small clutch I'd left in the storage room, the very same room I had overheard them in. Panic began to creep up my spine like ice. I called the bank's customer service line, each ring tightening the knot in my stomach. After what felt like an eternity navigating the automated prompts, a rep finally answered. "I need to report an unauthorized transfer," I said, trying to keep my voice level. There was a pause as she pulled up the account. "I do see the transaction," she confirmed. "It was processed through your mobile app, using the device on file and your existing credentials." "No," I said, heart pounding. "I didn't authorize it. I wasn't even holding my phone at that time." "Was your phone in your possession the entire evening?" she asked. I closed my eyes, already knowing where this was headed. No, it hadn't been. It had been in that room, unattended, accessible, to them. I ended the call feeling like I couldn't breathe. I knew my banking app required a PIN or fingerprint for transfers, but my PIN? God. My PIN was Noah's birthday, a number I had chosen years ago and never thought twice about. And my mother? Of course she knew it. She'd written it on birthday cakes and RSVP cards and monogrammed towels. My entire body buzzed with disbelief and fury. It wasn't just the money, it was the violation, the entitlement, the casual ease with which they had taken from me, assuming I'd stay quiet, that I always would. But they were wrong. Something in me had snapped, and this time, it wasn't going to break quietly. I picked up my phone and texted the one person I trusted to help me make sense of this. "Chloe," I wrote, "they stole from me. My own mother transferred $400 from my account without permission. What do I do now?" She replied immediately, "You fight, and this time you don't do it alone." Chloe didn't hesitate. As soon as she read my message, she called. "I'm coming over," she said. "You are not handling this alone." An hour later, she arrived with bagels, coffee, and a fire in her eyes that I hadn't seen since college finals. She sat across from me at my dining table, looked at the screenshots of the bank transfer, and didn't even try to hide her fury. "This is theft, Ariana," she said firmly. "You need a lawyer." I hesitated. A lawyer? Against my own mother? But deep down, I already knew she was right. So I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in months, Jasmine Patel, a former classmate from Northwestern Law who now specialized in family and financial disputes. We weren't close, but I remembered her being sharp, practical, and unshakable, exactly what I needed now. She agreed to meet that afternoon at a quiet cafe near Wicker Park. I showed up early, folder in hand, heart pounding. When Jasmine arrived, she didn't waste time with small talk. "Tell me everything," she said. And I did. Every brutal, humiliating detail, how much I had spent, the roles they had pushed on me, the overheard conversation, the stolen pin. Jasmine listened, took notes, and only interrupted to ask for clarification on dates and amounts. When I finished, she closed her notebook and said calmly, "You have a very clear case, Ariana. What they did wasn't just morally wrong. It's criminal." My throat tightened. "But they're my family." She nodded. "Which makes it harder. But it doesn't make it any less illegal." Then she asked the question that had been hovering in the back of my mind since last night. "What outcome do you want?" It stopped me cold, because I didn't know. Did I want my money back? Absolutely. But it was more than that. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted accountability. I wanted them to understand that they couldn't just keep taking from me like I didn't matter, like I was a tool instead of a person. "I want them to know they crossed a line," I said finally. "And I want them to pay it back. Every cent, including what I spent on the wedding." Jasmine nodded. "Then we'll start with a demand letter. Detailed. Formal. And we'll include a drafted police report to send with it, just in case they think you're bluffing." By the end of the meeting, we had a plan. A written demand for the full return of funds, $8,400 for the unauthorized transfer, $21,786 in documented wedding expenses, interest, documentation, and damages. All outlined, all legally sound, all real. As I left the cafe with the envelope in my bag, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not yet, but a flicker of power I hadn't felt in years. They wanted to treat me like I was disposable. But I was about to remind them exactly who they'd underestimated. That night, I didn't sleep much. Again. But this time, it wasn't anxiety that kept me awake. It was adrenaline, purpose, a strange, unfamiliar sense of control. I laid everything out on my kitchen table: Jasmine's demand letter, the drafted police report, printed screenshots of the bank transfer, itemized receipts for every wedding expense. It looked less like a family dispute and more like an investigation file, because that's what it was. The next morning, I woke up early, dressed carefully in a navy blue blazer and slacks, the same outfit I wore when pitching to high-end clients. Not because I wanted to impress them, but because I needed to remind myself, I am not a child in that house anymore. The confrontation would happen at the post-wedding brunch hosted at my parents' home in Evanston. Valerie had sent out the group text like always, cheerful, effortless, oblivious. "Brunch starts at 11. Dress casual but classy. Can't wait to celebrate." Celebrate what, exactly? I drove in silence, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. The folder sat on the passenger seat beside me like a quiet threat. I kept telling myself this wasn't vengeance, it was justice, boundaries, self-respect. But still, my stomach churned. The house looked exactly the same, pristine, symmetrical, cold. The front door opened before I even rang the bell. The housekeeper gave me a polite smile and motioned toward the sunroom. "They're all in there, Miss Ariana." The clinking of mimosa glasses and Camille's soft laughter drifted through the doorway. Valerie was in her element, playing host, basking in the glow of a flawless wedding that she hadn't lifted a finger to plan. When she saw me, she lit up. "Darling, there you are. We were just about to start without you. Brunch is getting cold." I smiled thinly. "Sorry I'm late. I had some banking issues to resolve." A flicker crossed her face. Guilt, maybe, or just annoyance. But she recovered quickly. "Well, you're here now. Go grab a plate." I didn't move toward the buffet. Instead, I walked to the edge of the table, pulled out the envelope from my bag, and laid it flat in front of her. "What's this?" she asked, still in that bright, hostess tone. I looked her directly in the eyes. "Something we need to discuss, as a family." Martin, seated with a newspaper, looked up. Camille's parents glanced at one another, suddenly aware that the temperature in the room had shifted. "There was a transfer," I said, my voice steady. "From my account to yours, $8,400. It happened during the reception." Valerie's smile faltered. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, sweetheart." "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I cut in. "And I have proof. The transaction logs, the timeline, the app access, the fact that you knew my PIN." The room went quiet. I glanced around at the stunned faces, at the tension beginning to bloom in my father's jaw, and I knew, this time, they weren't going to talk their way out of it. This time, I had come prepared, and I wasn't leaving until they knew that. The silence that followed my statement wasn't just awkward, it was seismic. You could feel the air shift, like the entire room had sucked in a collective breath and forgot how to let it go. Martin was the first to speak, his voice sharp and quiet. "Perhaps this isn't the appropriate time, Ariana." "When would be appropriate?" I asked, meeting his gaze. "When I'm not in the room? Like when you planned the wedding budget? Or when my money was transferred without my consent?" Across the table, Camille's parents shifted uncomfortably. Her mother cleared her throat and started to stand. "Maybe we should give your family some privacy." "No," I said, stopping her gently but firmly. "Please stay. I'd actually prefer witnesses this time." Valerie's face hardened. "You're being dramatic. If there was a transfer, I'm sure it was simply a misunderstanding." I opened the folder and pulled out the first sheet, the transaction log. I slid it across the table. "This was done through my mobile app, while I was working the reception, while I wasn't even near my phone. You took it, you knew my PIN, and you made the transfer." Camille's father blinked. "Valerie, is this true?" Valerie didn't answer. She just reached for her mimosa and sipped. Martin sighed and leaned forward, scanning the document. "Ariana, your mother and I have spent a fortune on this wedding. If there were additional expenses, I'm sure she assumed—" "She didn't assume," I said, louder now. "She stole, and I heard her, in the office, telling Noah I'd never notice." All eyes turned to my brother. Noah shifted in his seat, avoiding my gaze. I didn't know she actually did it. Mom said you were covering some things, and I thought—" "You thought it was okay because she always gets away with it," I finished for him. Valerie finally spoke. Her voice had lost its charm. "You're overreacting. That money went toward your brother's honeymoon upgrade. It wasn't like you were using it." My jaw clenched. "It wasn't yours to use." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, Ariana. You've always been so sensitive. We gave you everything. Education, a job at the company. A job you made unbearable. A position you gave me so you could ignore me more easily." I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I kept my voice level. "This isn't about a job, or a wedding. It's about respect. You used me, financially, emotionally, repeatedly. And now you've stolen from me. Valerie leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. What are you going to do? Call the police on your own mother? I reached back into the folder and pulled out the second document, the police report. I slid that across the table too. I won't have to, unless you leave me no choice. The room went utterly still. For the first time in my life, they weren't dismissing me. They were listening, because they finally understood. I was done playing the part they had written for me. For a long moment, no one said a word. The clinking of cutlery had stopped. The hum of polite conversation was replaced by an almost electric silence. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Valerie's lips tightened, the muscles in her jaw twitching beneath years of control. You're bluffing, she said at last, though her voice had lost its conviction. I'm not, I replied evenly, and I've already requested security footage from the Drake. Hallways, entrance to the storage room, everything from the hour of the transfer. I'd be very careful about doubling down right now. Martin looked between us, his brow furrowed in a way I hadn't seen since I was a teenager, when he still pretended to be a father who intervened. Valerie, he said slowly, did you really access her phone and authorize the transfer? She turned to him, incredulous. I did what needed to be done. For Noah. You know that upgrade wasn't going to pay for itself. That wasn't your decision to make, he said, more quietly now. And it sure as hell wasn't your money to take. Noah's voice broke in. Wait, that was the money for the island excursion? I didn't realize you used Ariana's account. I looked at him, finally letting him see the weight I'd been carrying. You didn't want to know. That's the problem. You let her run everything and closed your eyes. His face flushed with shame, but he didn't argue. And Camille, who'd been silent the whole time, slowly stood up from her seat. I had no idea, Ariana, she said softly, about any of this. I would have never asked for all those extras if I knew you were paying for them. I'm so sorry. Her voice shook slightly. I believed her. She turned to Valerie next. You told me Ariana's company was sponsoring most of the wedding. You said she wanted to use it for portfolio work. Valerie waved her off. It's not that simple. Yes, I cut in. It is. Then I opened the folder one last time and pulled out the final stack of papers. Itemized receipts. Every deposit, every invoice, every Venmo note and credit card statement, highlighted, labeled, logged by date and purpose. The floral installations? Me. The upgraded linens? Me. The cocktail hour? Me. The photographer Camille loved so much? Also me. Every single elevated touch you've been taking credit for? Me. I laid the thick packet in the center of the table. Martin reached for it with a heavy sigh, thumbing through the pages. With every flip, the color in his face drained a little more. And finally, he looked up and said, We'll return every cent, with interest. Valerie stared at him like he'd betrayed her. Martin. No, he said firmly. This went too far. And it ends now. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just nodded. Because in that moment I realized something. This wasn't about winning. It was about ending the pattern. And as I gathered my folder and stepped back from the table, I knew. It was already beginning to break. As I stood there, folder in hand, something strange washed over me. Not relief, not yet, but a quiet, steadying power. The kind that only comes when you've finally said the thing you spent years convincing yourself wasn't worth saying. Camille was still standing by the window, her hands clasped together, visibly shaken. Noah sat frozen in his seat, his mouth slightly open, like he'd only just realized the weight of what he'd allowed to happen. And Valerie, she looked like a woman watching the walls of her perfect world crumble in real time. Then she said it. I may have overstepped, Valerie muttered, eyes locked on the untouched mimosa in front of her. Her voice was tight, clipped, like every word cost her pride. "You stole from your daughter," Martin said bluntly. "Let's call it what it is." Her back stiffened. "I took money we both know she wasn't using." I looked at her, really looked, and for once didn't feel small under her gaze. "I was using it, Mom," I said, "for my life, for my future. Not for a destination honeymoon you lied about and manipulated me into funding." Valerie turned her face away, jaw clenched. "I never meant," she started, then stopped herself. "It was wrong." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was the closest thing I had ever gotten from her. Martin looked up from the receipts again. "The money will be returned in full, every dollar. Today." I nodded once. "That's the minimum." Valerie flinched at that. Like being told she owed me something emotionally was more offensive than stealing from me financially. Camille sat down slowly, her voice soft. "I don't think I've ever really seen how your family treats you until today." I gave her a tired smile. Took me years to see it myself. Then Noah stood. For the first time, he really looked at me, not like the big sister who fixed everything, not like the backup dancer in his lead role, but like someone he didn't fully understand, someone he maybe never tried to. "You deserved better," he said quietly. "Not just now. Always." The words hit something in me I didn't know was still tender. "I know," I replied. Behind us, I could hear the silverware shifting again, the subtle movements of Camille's parents preparing to leave, their faces drawn and polite and awkwardly apologetic. I slipped the folder back into my bag and turned toward the door. "You have 48 hours to send the full reimbursement," I said to Martin and Valerie. "I'll be watching for the transfer. If it doesn't show up, the police report goes through, simple as that." Valerie opened her mouth, maybe to protest, but Martin placed a firm hand on her arm. "She means it," he said. "Yes," I whispered, not looking back. "I do." And with that, I walked out of the sunroom, out of the house where I had once played pretend, trying to fit into a role I never auditioned for. But this time, I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't begging for respect. I was demanding it. And for the first time in my life, they were actually listening. The ride back to my apartment was quiet, but not heavy. For the first time in weeks, the silence wasn't suffocating. It was restorative. Like my nervous system was finally allowed to exhale. When I reached home, I didn't drop my keys on the counter or immediately turn on the lights like usual. I just stood in the doorway, taking in the stillness of my space. No accusations, no backhanded comments, no invisible pressure to perform for anyone's approval. Just me. In peace. That night, I lit a candle, lavender and cedarwood, and sank into the corner of my couch with a cup of tea. I stared at the ceiling, letting the weight of everything catch up. The confrontation, the betrayal, the strange feeling of being seen, even if it came late. My mind replayed Martin's face as he realized the severity. Noah's quiet acknowledgement, Camille's softened gaze. But mostly, I kept circling back to Valerie. Even now, part of me still wanted her to apologize, not in the forced, cornered way she had before, but in a way that acknowledged the years of subtle dismissal, the emotional bruises left by her impossible standards and cold indifference. But I knew better than to wait for a kind of closure she was never capable of giving. Her love, if you could call it that, had always come with conditions, and I wasn't interested in fulfilling any more terms. I opened my laptop and checked my banking app. And there it was, the full reimbursement wired from Martin's account. No note, no explanation, just the money sitting in my account like a reluctant admission of guilt. I stared at it for a moment before closing the screen. It wasn't the money I needed, though I wouldn't pretend it didn't matter. What I needed was exactly what I'd done: speak the truth out loud, regardless of how it was received. Set the boundary and hold it without shame. The next morning, I woke up lighter. I walked to my favorite cafe 2 blocks away, ordered a blueberry muffin and a black coffee, and sat at the corner table by the window. The barista smiled and told me I looked serene. I laughed a little. Maybe I did. I pulled out a small notebook and began to write. Not for work, not for anyone else's expectations, but for myself. I wrote about the power of naming betrayal, the quiet revolution of saying no, and how healing doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes, it tiptoes in after a war and sits beside you while you sip coffee in silence. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't angry. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't bracing myself for impact. I was simply free. A few days after receiving the transfer from Martin, I received an invitation in the mail. Thick ivory cardstock with embossed gold lettering. Camille and Noah were hosting a brunch at their new apartment to thank everyone who helped with the wedding. A small gathering, just family and close friends. I almost tossed it in the trash without thinking, but something in me paused. Not because I wanted to go, but because I didn't want to avoid it out of fear. This time, I wouldn't be walking in as the dutiful, invisible sister. I'd be walking in as someone who had finally remembered her worth. So that Sunday morning, I got dressed in a soft navy dress that made me feel grounded. I tied my hair back, not out of formality, but because I liked the way it framed my face that way. And I walked the familiar route through the city to Camille's building, the chill October air nipping at my cheeks. When I entered the apartment, it was all warm colors and cozy music, the kind of atmosphere meant to convince you everything had always been fine. But I no longer swallowed that illusion. Camille approached me first, her smile unsure but sincere. "Hey, I wasn't sure if you'd come." "I wasn't either," I said gently. "But I'm glad I did." She nodded, her eyes dropping slightly. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. I didn't realize how much I missed Malene. I really didn't. I didn't need her to grovel. I just needed her to listen." "Thanks for saying that," I replied. "That means something." A beat passed before she quietly added, "I hope this can be a beginning, not the end." I nodded. "So do I." Across the room, Valerie sat stiffly on the couch, a glass of orange juice in hand, her posture impeccable, her eyes avoiding mine. And for the first time, I didn't care. I didn't care if she ever acknowledged what she'd done. I didn't care if she ever apologized. I had done the work. I had faced the silence. I had spoken the truth in front of everyone who mattered, even those who once made me feel like I didn't. I mingled a bit, talked with Noah, shared a laugh with an old family friend, and then, without fanfare, I left. As I stepped outside into the sunlight, a soft breeze tugged at the hem of my dress. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because for once, I had stopped abandoning myself. And that changed everything. The day after that humiliating phone call with Camille, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept looping that one sentence she hissed like it was a curse. "You were never supposed to be part of this day." It rang in my ears like a verdict I'd somehow missed all these years. I stayed in bed until noon, then finally got up and took a walk around Harvard Square. People moved with purpose, sipping iced coffees, laughing with friends, carrying books, hugging strangers. I felt like I'd been dropped into a world I no longer belonged to, or maybe never did. I stopped at a little bookstore and sat by the poetry section. That's when it hit me. How much of myself I had lost. Not just in the wedding, but over years of giving and shrinking and explaining and earning love that should have never been conditional. A woman nearby was reading to her daughter. I watched them, how the child curled into her mother's arm without asking for permission, how the mother rested her cheek on her daughter's head like it was the most natural thing in the world, and I realized I had never known that kind of safety, not with my own mother, not with Camille. That evening, I opened my laptop, not to respond to Valerie's last message about the vendor refund, but to draft something for me. A boundary. A truth. I wrote, "From this point forward, I will not be attending Camille's wedding. I will not contribute further. I do not owe explanations, apologies, or negotiations. I have given, and I have been erased. You may call it selfish. I call it survival." Then I turned off my phone. For the first time in weeks, I breathed without a knot in my chest. But what happened next, I wasn't prepared for. Because when silence replaced my labor, that's when the real backlash began. The silence didn't last long. Just 2 days after I sent that message, I got a knock at the door. It was my mother. Not with flowers, not with remorse, just with that signature tight smile she wore whenever she was about to manipulate someone into guilt. She stepped inside like she owned the space, ignoring my boundaries, my choices, everything I had just said. "I thought we could talk, face to face," she said, scanning my apartment like it offended her. There was no, "I'm sorry," no, "I didn't know it hurt you." Just more of the same, justification wrapped in pleasantries. She said Camille was under a lot of pressure, that I had misinterpreted things, and that I was blowing it all out of proportion. I sat on the edge of my couch, gripping the armrest, willing myself not to snap. But then she said it. "You've always been sensitive, Miranda. You take things too personally. This is Camille's special time, and you're making it about yourself." That sentence burned more than the betrayal itself. Not because it was new, but because it was the same story they'd used to excuse every slight, every oversight, every time they made me invisible. I stood up. "No," I said, steady this time. "What I'm doing is choosing myself, for once. And if that looks selfish to you, that says more about what you've expected from me than it does about who I am." She blinked. Her mouth twitched, like she was about to correct me, but this time, she didn't. I walked her to the door without another word. That night, I cried, not from sadness, but from release, from finally saying out loud what I had been swallowing for decades. And just when I thought things might begin to quiet down, the wedding planner called me. Apparently, there had been a major fallout in Camille's bridal party. One of her closest bridesmaids had dropped out. And the reason? She told Camille, "I can't support how you've treated your sister." For the first time, someone saw. Someone spoke, and it shifted everything. When the wedding planner's call ended, I sat there stunned, phone in hand, heart pounding. It wasn't about the bridesmaid stepping down. It was about someone finally refusing to stay silent. That moment cracked something open in me. Not anger, not even vindication, something quieter, something like peace. I didn't rush to call anyone. I didn't post about it. I simply walked to my balcony, took in the fading Chicago skyline, and let the stillness hold me. 2 days later, Camille reached out. Her tone was different, hollow, like someone who'd been forced to look in a mirror they weren't ready to face. She asked if we could talk, said she wanted to understand, to fix things before the wedding. But the timing, like always, was convenient, not rooted in love, but in damage control. I agreed to meet, but this time I chose the place. A quiet corner of Lincoln Park, near the path where I used to jog before sunrise when life felt heavier than I could explain. She arrived in designer heels and oversized sunglasses, still the same polished image. But her voice cracked when she said, "I didn't realize how much I hurt you." I didn't offer comfort. I didn't rush in to reassure her. I let the silence do its work. "I thought you had it all together," she continued. "You never asked for anything." I looked at her, not with resentment, but with clarity. "You never listened when I tried." Camille blinked, eyes glossy. "I didn't know how to be a sister to you. I guess. I only knew how to compete." There it was, the truth I'd felt since childhood, but had never heard aloud. And somehow, hearing it didn't bring anger anymore. It brought something more powerful. Release. I nodded. "We don't have to go back, but we don't have to pretend either." She asked if I'd still come to the wedding. For the first time in a long time, I answered with no guilt, no fear. "I'll think about it." And I meant it. I didn't go to the wedding. Instead, I spent that weekend in a cozy lakeside cabin just outside Madison, a place I used to dream about but never gave myself permission to enjoy. No makeup, no tight dress, just me, a mug of hot tea, a journal, and the quiet hum of peace I'd fought years to find. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic confrontations, just soft clarity. I wasn't the villain in anyone's story. I was just the girl who stopped asking for a seat at a table where she was never truly welcomed. As I watched the trees dance with the breeze outside, I realized something that shook me gently to my core. Healing doesn't always come with closure. Sometimes it comes with absence. With choosing not to show up for people who only remember you when it's convenient. I had spent so long believing that being the bigger person meant staying silent, swallowing hurt, and being endlessly available. But real growth? Real growth is choosing yourself, even when no one else does. I've learned that blood doesn't entitle anyone to your boundaries, that silence isn't always strength, sometimes it's survival, and that peace isn't given. It's built, brick by brick, truth by truth. To anyone listening who's ever been excluded, overlooked, or made to feel like they only mattered when they were useful, I see you. I was you. And now, I'm free. So take the space you need. Set the boundaries they said were too harsh. Grieve the version of family you thought you had. And then create one that honors the real you. Because your story doesn't end in their absence. It begins in your presence. If this journey touched something in you, please don't forget to subscribe, like, share, or leave a comment. Your voice matters, and you're not alone.